Thank you very much to my very enthusiastic friends and boyfriends sitting in this audience. And also, of course, thank you very much, Charlie, for giving me the opportunity to speak on such a topical motion close to my heart, although I did warn you that this motion was slightly too extreme. So I'm quite happy to be speaking on the opposition tonight. Charlie, I'm very glad to be able to call you a friend, and I'm also very glad that I didn't run against you for president 2 terms ago, because you probably wouldn't be sitting there in that chair right now. I also hope that this paper speech is going to go better than my previous few, one of which has been dubbed on YouTube and one of which has been cancelled. And I was told that I have a voice for a silent film in one of my previous speeches. So I'm very consciously trying to lower my pitch and be less screechy for this debate. But before I get started, I'd like to clarify certain things in this debate. Firstly, I'm a competitive debater. I am here to make arguments about the debate and not about myself. So note that this shouldn't be a debate settled through identity politics or appeals to emotions. Let's look at the wording of the motion, and let's look at the logic provided. Prop has 2 burdens to prove to win this debate. Firstly, they have to prove that China is a threat to our way of life, which, by the way, you haven't really defined what our is, which I will do for you later. Second, not only do you have to prove that, but you also have to show that such a threat is existential to our way of life. Note that this is an incredibly high burden, and even if we accept that there are some things that China does we completely do not agree with, or even if China poses some threat to the West, this does not necessarily entail that you support the proposition. So this is the first, most important point to note for today's debate. Secondly, all countries have their errors and weaknesses, and all great powers have their limitations and shortcomings. China is by no means perfect, and I'm not standing here today to argue that it is. But this is not a debate about whether China is bad or whether China is evil. This is a debate about whether China has the ability to directly and fundamentally transform our ways of life and do so in a way that's existential to our civilizational continuity. With that, I'm going to present 3 arguments on opposition. Firstly, that democracies are far more resilient than you think, and therefore this existential threat is massively blown out of proportion. Secondly, that China is uninterested in reshaping the way we lead our lives. Its global interests are fundamentally economic in nature, which is why it does not pose an existential threat to democracy, freedom, whatever values that Spencer has laid out in his speech. And third argument, that we need to think carefully about the consequences of the way we vote tonight. By framing China as an existential threat, this has far larger implications than you might first believe. But before I move on to my speech, it falls upon me to introduce the speakers on the opposing side. You've just heard from Spencer Shia, a master's student studying late antique and Byzantine studies and our esteemed chair of the consultative committee. He is about as relevant and nearly as old as the degree which he is studying. And even though we are the polar opposites on many political opinions, as you have mentioned, and you are also known as the biggest Tory on committee, I still have a lot of respect for you, and I'm glad to be able to call you my friend. Secondly, we are going to hear from Mr. Wu Kaixi, a political commentator best known for his leading role during the Tiananmen protests of 1989. You've done some pretty incredible things, I'm not gonna lie, so it's quite difficult to find a roast for you, especially when you have 2 students sitting on either side of you. But I think a lot of us can relate to you because you have run for election for the Taiwanese parliament twice and haven't got on. So I'm sure lots of budding politicians will have to experience that in their life. Once. Apologies, I stand corrected. Thirdly, we're going to hear from Alex Duckworth, a first-year history and politics student at Christ Church and a member of the Secretaries Committee. I'm not going to make the obvious joke here about committee cest because her parents are here tonight. Hi, Mr. and Dr. Duckworth. But the one thing I'm going to say about Alex is you can't speak Mandarin, you can barely use chopsticks, and you also have the most private school British accent I have ever heard at Oxford. So we're really scraping the bottom of the barrel here. Mr. President, these are your speakers, and they are most welcome. Right, so before going into the arguments that I have outlined, I have a couple responses to the wonderful speech that Mr. Spencer Shia has brought to the House today. Other than going massively over time, brevity is a virtue, by the way, there are a couple things that he has failed to do in his speech. Firstly, for all that he has said, he's defined China, he's defined existential threat, he's defined way of life. He hasn't actually talked about what our way of life means. And this is very, very important, right? No. You've had 12 minutes to speak and you didn't talk about this. So why is this an important point of clarification for this debate? Because most people would take our way of life as the West's way of life. As you defined, this house is the Oxford Union. We are situated in the UK, in the liberal West, and therefore this motion, in our way of life, should be talking about, as you say, Western liberal democracy, freedom, and all these values that you espouse. That is why a lot of the arguments you presented are actually pretty irrelevant to this debate. When you talk a lot about China's internal policies, how it might not be the best leader within its own country or within countries in other Southeast Asia regions, I think a lot of these arguments fall by the wayside when we look at the motion and what your burden is actually to prove. If you're going to argue that China is an existential threat to democracy and to liberal values, you cannot at the same time use arguments of how China is trying to affect poor, underdeveloped countries as basically examples for this case. Secondly, a lot of arguments that Spencer brings tonight are not exclusive to China, and in fact, many countries in the West are much worse culprits of this. When you talk about surveillance and infiltration by China, may I ask, what has the US been doing for the past 100 years? Look at what the CIA has done. Look at what intelligence agencies in the West has done, right? A lot of these countries have done far worse than what China has. So therefore, on your own metrics on how one country can pose an existential threat to other countries, China is actually very, very low on this list of countries, and therefore, on your own metrics, you fall. So, on to my first argument, on why democratic norms and values are enduring and are here to stay. I hope to show through this argument that the West and the values and the liberal institutions that we talk about are actually far stronger than Spencer has portrayed, and therefore, even if we accept that there is some sort of threat to them currently by China, they are not existential. Right. Let's look at the power of our civil societies in the West, including places like Europe, like America. Let's look at the openness and plurality of these countries, of the cultures, the different migrants and talents that these countries possess. Above all, they all have a resilient rule of law and well-equipped state and democratic infrastructures that can and have taken on challenges with ease. And please note that these institutions have endured for hundreds of years through all sorts of challenges and threats that have come their way. If you, for example, look at why immigration is still such a big thing, why there has been massive brain drain from lots of countries to, say, America, to Europe, there's a reason for that. And that's because people still look to them as bastions of free speech, of all these liberal values that they believe are important. And what this shows is that these democratic institutions that people believe in, they still believe in and are still here to stay. Look at the Oxford Union, for example. Not to be too self-aggrandizing here, but we can have debates about political system and regime types. We can have debates about national leaders and controversial ideas, as evidenced by Charlie's term here. Can we say that we have the same in other countries around the world? I leave the answer up to you. But what this shows is that these Western countries and the UK, which we are all in right now, still has a lot of these values that we hold dear to our heart. Therefore, democracies may be imperfect, but they are here to stay. And it is ridiculous to argue that there is an existential threat and that China is the existential threat that is going to tear down all these institutions that have withstood the test of time. But if democracies are here to stay, then we must also constantly remind ourselves of the importance of being realistic and accurate in our understanding of other countries. Spencer talks about the CCP's grand plan for world domination. Let me tell you, there is no such thing. My second argument is on why China isn't that expansionist. China basically does not care about other countries, right? The two things that China cares most about are A, economic growth, and B, internal political stability. Anything else outside its borders, as long as it does not threaten these two aims, are not relevant to the Chinese government. This is especially the case given the past few years of socioeconomic turmoil, especially in the post-COVID era, where the one main focus that China has been trying to do is to rebuild its economy after years of lockdowns. So therefore, China is actually currently in a pretty weak state to try and export their global authoritarianism or to dominate the world right now. They have far better priorities to focus on. Let's look at their lack of intervention in foreign conflicts that don't concern their internal goals. This demonstrates that they don't care about overseas projection. Beijing is primarily concerned with questions of domestic political order and national unity. And the examples raised about Hong Kong, about Taiwan, about the South China Sea are all issues that concern their integrity of their borders and their country. They are not a goal to export anything outside their borders. Yes?
Is it against international law to expand your borders by force and to annex neighboring territories?
My point is that to China, these are seen as internal issues relating to borders and relating to integrity of the country. So therefore, this... No, thank you. No, thank you. So the point here is that they have not had direct concern or confrontation with the West, which is the scope of the debate we should be arguing today. China, for example, has not directly contributed military aid as of the second to the war in Ukraine, and China is not concerned with foreign conflicts that have been going on in other countries. Let's compare China to the US or even the UK, which have had far more interventions in external conflicts. For example, the Vietnam War, interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, supplying arms to Kurdish rebels, involvement with the Ukraine crisis right now, or looking further back, the massive legacy of colonialism and slavery, the effects of which still reverberate throughout the entire world today. The CCP, in comparison, engages in no such things because they just don't wish to impose undue financial, fiscal burdens onto themselves. The last war that they fought was over 30 years ago. It is incredibly hypocritical to frame China as an existential threat when the US parades around naming themselves as the world police and bastions of the global order, and they try to export their version of whatever best form of government, economic policy is to different countries around the world. Look at the Chicago School of Economics, what they've done in Latin America, and how they've wanted to export their economic ideas to all parts of the world, and the chaos and turbulence that have caused in those countries. We think that to frame China as an existential threat is hypocritical when we look at other countries which have done so much worse compared to what China has done. Look, there are clear tensions and disagreements between China and the West across a plethora of dimensions. As mentioned, these include values, these include economic policies, the way to run a government, and beyond. But we cannot conflate these divergences in opinions and in the way they run the country to an actively antagonistic relationship, let alone a conflictual one. Indeed, if we accept that preventing a hot war is the most important, we must make sure that we have a pragmatic and fair understanding of China. Lastly, what are the implications if we vote that China is an existential threat? The phrasing of China as an existential threat is honestly just fear-mongering and a continuation of the Red Scare that's happened for so long, with the consequences being very palpable. This looks like increased racism and xenophobia towards people of Chinese descent. This looks like turning away prospective talent from the most populous country in the world. This looks like feeding into allegations and narratives about purported Western decline by extreme nationalists in the West, and also diminishing the soft power of the West. If you wish to have any power over how China runs its country and its internal affairs, Phrasing or framing them as an existential threat is going to be the biggest hindrance to this. In addition, you are tying the hands of policymakers by forcing them to go down a military arms race, which in turn feeds security dilemma and a vicious cycle, where the more hawkish the West is on China, the more hawkish and militant China is going to be in response. So this is a very, very dangerous path to go down if you frame China as an existential threat. And above all, by doing this and supporting this motion tonight, we end up neglecting the much more urgent and important existential risks to the world today. Things like climate change, which pose an actual existential threat to a lot of the world, where some countries are actually going underwater and suffering incredibly extreme weather
point of
conditions.
information?
Yes.
And which country is the largest polluter in the world?
If you count the hundreds of years since the Industrial Revolution, for example, where China was closed off to the rest of the world, I think you'd know that the West actually has been the biggest polluters and contributors to climate change. No. So other existential threats like the rise of AI, which most of us in this room probably don't understand, risks of technology and technological platforms threatening our democracy, all these issues are proper existential threats that require joint coordination and collaboration. And when you say China is an existential threat, China is not going to cooperate you on these very, very real issues that require cooperation and global coordination and solving the collective action problem. So therefore, the implications of framing China as an existential threat are incredibly severe. Think carefully about how you're going to vote tonight. As I've talked about, these are the implications of what will happen if we frame China as an existential threat. We've already talked about how the West has actually done far more things that contribute to existential threats to other countries around the world compared to China. We've told you how China actually does not care about spreading this global imperialist agenda compared to countries in the West, which have done so for hundreds of years. And therefore, to vote, we must be faithful to the motion and vote against side proposition. I am so proud to oppose.